If you are a regular listener of this show, then you know that we started accepting sponsors about a year ago. And I have to say that while I would continue to do this, whether we had sponsors or not, having that support has definitely allowed me to make the show better on many levels. And now that the show has grown some, a lot of corporations have reached out. But frankly, a lot of times they haven't measured up to the kind of integrity that we want to have. Fortunately, we've found that working with quality businesses and projects from among our own community, colleagues, listeners of the podcast, friends, has worked out wonderfully. They're seeing positive impact from being associated with the podcast, and we feel good about promoting them. So we have a few spots left, and we'd like to fill those last few spots with you and your thing. We're looking for independent, like-minded people who are creating small yoga businesses and projects that prioritize integrity and quality. If this sounds like you, go to jbrownyoga.com/sponsor. Okay, look at that. We're back. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If you're new, welcome. If you're returning, what's up? How's it going? What are you doing? Your new year's going okay so far, I assume, and haven't had that much of it yet. We couldn't have screwed things up too much yet, could we have? I'm happy to say I am home. I'm back in the studio again. I've got big plans for this place. Anybody in the Lehigh Valley area, I'm in Allentown. I got classes. I got a workshop I'm doing. I got some stuff going on. Other kind of interesting, cool news, just for anybody who's been listening for a long time. I am going to be going back to Brooklyn. So many of you know I had a yoga center in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. It was at 628 Metropolitan Avenue. I basically spent 10 years of my life in that space. I then let someone buy me out of my lease and moved. The person who took it over from me opened Hot Spot Yoga. I'm not making that up, by the way. Those of you will remember tearful intros. Well, that person, they did not even last a year. And a few months ago, I got contacted by the new owner of that space, which is the folks from Good Yoga. Anybody in Brooklyn knows Good Yoga. They've been around. They opened right around the same time that I opened, but the owner there, Flannery, she's got several locations now, and she's still going strong, and she took over the space. She reached out to me, and she said, if you ever wanted to come teach a workshop sometime, let me know. And so I have a date, so I'm going to teach a workshop, but that's not the coolest part. I'm going to be there March 16th for a workshop, but that night, the night of March 16th, I'm going to do the first of a series of live events, and I'm going to do a live event from the old space on Metropolitan Avenue in Brooklyn, March 16th. So that's just a cool kind of convergence thing. Again, anybody who remembers that old time might know how fun that is for me. So that's something that's happening. What else? Oh, I'm getting ready to leave. I'm leaving in like less than a week. I'm going to London, teach some workshops at Tri Yoga. And speaking of which, I never mentioned, I did their podcast. I went on the Tri Yoga podcast. I don't know if you guys know. They have a podcast. Jenny is the host, and I went on her podcast, and we talked about all kinds of stuff that I have not talked about here. So I encourage you to go check that out. But that's not really why we're here today, not just to plug all of my stuff. We're here to listen to today's podcast with Kerry Maiorca. She's the chairman of the board at the Yoga Alliance. And those of you remembered, I got kind of in an agitated way about Yoga Alliance. I wrote this blog post. I got myself into all kinds of trouble. This was me working through it all. And fortunately, Kerry and I go way back. You will hear that. We do spend just a little time establishing our history together. But then we do really get into it. And I think because I knew Kerry. I felt like I could be candid with her, and I was, and I think it made for a very honest conversation. And I'm very excited for you guys to hear it today. Before we listen to it, let me say one thing about yoganatomy.net, today's sponsor. I've talked about them a bunch. It's the educational resource of Leslie Kamenoff and Amy Matthews. And this is something I know intimately. I used their fundamentals course in my training programs. If you're someone who does a teacher training program, they have a 20-hour fundamentals course that you can incorporate into your training. Or even if you just want some continuing education as an individual teacher, you can just do it as a standalone continuing education. They are friends of mine. They're teachers of mine. They've been on the podcast. Go listen to it. They're both invaluable resources. So if you or anyone you know is in need of some yoga anatomy study, or even if you just want some deep yoga learning, I highly recommend going to yoganatomy.net. Also, as I mentioned, I'm going to be in London, January 11th through 13th. I'm going to be in Tel Aviv, Israel, also January 18th through 20th. And my 2019 schedule is up. There's still a few things being added, but you can find out about all those dates. You can listen to the archives of the podcast and read my blog and find all of my online yoga video stuff. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, so my talk with Kerry today is lengthy. We had a lot of ground to cover, so I will forgo any further rambling, and we will get to it. I will touch base with you on the other side, just let you know who's coming on. But for now, let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Kerry Maiorca.
Hello?
Hello, is this Kerry?
Hi, hey, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Give me 1 second. I'm having problems with this set of headphones. Hold on 1 second.
All right.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. All right. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How about you?
I'm doing okay, all things considered. I had a really lovely class this afternoon. Just
Nice.
2 people, but you know, when you have like people who've come who just have come in just the best way possible, you know, and like the best spirit of inquiry and yoga you could ever ask for as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, it just felt like a great, you know, one of those great times where it's like, oh yeah, I like being a yoga teacher today.
Yeah, those times really fill you up and make you feel connected to both the people in front of you, but also why you started doing this in the first place.
I know. And it's funny that we talk about when we started doing this in the first place, because I was trying to remember, maybe you can remind me, were we in the same teacher training group of Allison's, or were you in the group just after me?
No, we were in the same one.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That's a first. You're the only person I've talked to that was in my teacher training with me. Wow. Okay, so this is great. All right, so I'm curious, what do you remember like about the training? Like if you were to describe what our teacher training was like, what do you think of that? And then also, and this is the really fun one for me, is what was I like? Like in your mind at that time, what was I like? And don't be nice, like tell me everything.
All right, fun questions. Well, what I remember was sort of the endurance it took to go through the training. That's sort of the number one thing, because it was the 30 days and, you know, it was so intense. So I remember, you know, having practice sessions. I remember just being so excited, inspired, and totally overwhelmed at the same time. The other really big takeaway, and I've shared this with my trainees in subsequent years, is I remember that we did not teach until the last day. Mm-hmm. And I remember building it up in my mind. And then I got everyone into Supta Virasana. Great choice. I picked the pose myself. No props. And then I just kept them there. And eventually Allison, kind soul that she was, whispered to me, "You may want to get them out of the pose." So I remember that about the training. I remember just it being so wonderful. I loved Allison. I think she does such a great job. And I really appreciated her detailed orientation to alignment, but also the way she kind of combined that with the vinyasa approach and the Ashtanga background she had. And that was really what drew me to the program. But it was a wonderful first experience. I just remember being young and being a bit overwhelmed. But I do have a very specific memory of you, actually. And you, my memory of you was your handstand to chaturanga slow motion action. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that?
Oh,
that
yes, I was. I know what you're talking about very well. It was a signature move.
Yeah. That's my memory, and I remember you being very passionate about it and interested. And I feel like I feel like my memories of that are a bit hazy too. I mean, it's
a while.
20 years ago, actually.
How is it 20 years ago? How is that
which
happening?
Is crazy.
Oh my
gosh.
But
I do remember, I feel like I remember maybe you asking some good questions, challenging questions. I remember it just being a great time overall. It was wonderful.
Had you studied with Allison much before the training?
Not too much.
Yeah.
I was kind of making my way through the Lower East Side, New York yoga scene. Mm-hmm. I had started my very first yoga class in an actual classroom. Like my first yoga was on TV when I was, my seat after I graduated from high school. And I didn't know it was yoga because they didn't call it that. But I loved it. And then my first classroom experience was at Jivamukti. Mm-hmm. And
me too. On 2nd Avenue?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Wow. Do you remember the teacher?
I sure do. It was Cliff.
Cliff. Oh my God. I haven't thought of Cliff in forever.
Yeah.
He was great. I remember Cliff. Yeah. And then mine was Kachi. They were like in the same class.
Kachi was wonderful. I gravitated towards Kachi pretty soon after, and I took class with her so much and just loved her. I thought she was amazing.
I know. She was like living it in such a real way. It was very inspiring.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she was the real deal. And just such a kind person. And we both had a dance background too, which I really, I think resonated with her from that as well. But I don't know, maybe a year into Jivamukti, or maybe even less, it might have been, a few months, I went full into Ashtanga. Uh-huh. And so I was there for the Mysore practice every morning. I was the first one there. And I was just I was
But you were doing
on fire.
You didn't go to Eddie's place?
Well, no, I did Jivamukti for a while, and then I switched over to Eddie's.
Yeah.
And that was great. Eddie was fabulous, and that was a really amazing experience. And then from there, I hopped over to Allison because I started just experiencing some challenges. I was having... There's only so many times you can drop back to back bend, walk your hands to your ankles, and then have them walked up to your knees before you start having problems.
Yeah, when we were in our 20s, we were like, no problem, right? And then...
Well, that's the thing is it kind of... I thought, well, this is fine. I can bounce back. I'm resilient. But I started having issues. So my body, it was not a great fit because I needed the stability and the strength.
See, that makes sense. The same similar thing for me is at one point I just felt like I wanted to be smarter about yoga, and Allison was so smart about everything. She was had that art history background. She had studied all three of those systems, Shivananda, Iyengar, and Ashtanga, and she was really kind of putting out a lot of really useful information. She was just wicked smart.
Oh, definitely. And I think, from Allison, because, she combined the sort of vinyasa of Ashtanga-esque approach with the detailed pose holding, kind of come around and look at this. She was sort of the first teacher, I think, where I learned about the power of observation and the importance of that as a teacher and as a student. And I really, from there, that kind of became a primary criteria for me from every other teacher, after I moved from New York. That's, I think, the biggest takeaway for me is so much is about, not just about like memorizing the form, understanding where the props go, knowing the alignment of your arm or your leg. It's really about precise observation, and not for the purpose of getting the pose right, but really that, that's what I've taken away is it's not for that. It's for really see, and to see not just with your eyes, but to also feel what's happening for a student in a pose. And I feel like she kind of opened that door for me.
Wow. Well, I think she certainly was about observation, because I think she had a way of looking at people and their poses that even came from being able to look at sculpture. Like, she just was really impeccable about the way that she spoke about yoga and what she was doing. Now, I have to say, she was a very intense teacher, though. And I remember I had been studying with her very regularly, like several times a week for a couple of years, at least a year and a half before that training happened. And I just remember thinking, wow, these people who didn't really know her, this must be so crazy. Because like I was already used to her, doing 2 rounds of Kapalabhati, 1 round 100 pumpings, 1 round 150 pumpings. We did it every morning, remember?
Yeah.
And I remember I was used to that because we used to do it in class all the time. So I just remember thinking, kind of feeling bad for everybody. And sometimes people were like, I don't know, they're looking at me as though I was somehow something they didn't have. But I was like, no, I've just been around. I knew all of her stuff,
Yeah. Well, I think that, from my perspective, I had the advantage of sort of being so open and new to everything. By the time I did Allison's training, I'd been practicing, like basically every day. I mean, I was maybe a bit over the top in the beginning in terms of my commitment, but it had been about 2 years from the first day I walked into a class to the day I did that training. And I just was so open and receptive, and I just loved Allison's personality. I mean, she was so herself. The intensity of it, I just kind of was like, oh, great, this is what we're doing. Let's do it.
Yeah,
I think I had that going for me.
I think some people could like jive with her personality more than others. Yeah. And I certainly did. I certainly learned so much from her and benefited from my time with her. Mm-hmm. But then we both kind of went off, and you left New York pretty soon, right? Like when did you leave New York?
I left New York in August of 98. So after we were done.
Yeah, right after the training you left.
Sure. Yeah.
Wow, so what was in Chicago? What made you, were you always planning to leave, or why did that happen?
I am originally from Chicago, and I was in New York to finish my undergrad. I had transferred, so I was in Colorado College for my first year, and then I ended up doing kind of a condensed undergrad because I had a ton of credits that transferred over from dance, and I just took summer school. And so I kind of finished up in August, my schooling. And so then my plan was, I had done New York. I had really done it up. I mean, I was in the dance world. I was performing with a small modern dance company. I was ushering everywhere, taking 1 million yoga classes. I honestly just kind of exhausted myself by the end of it. Like, I think I was ready for things to slow down, and I wanted to kind of just see what the next chapter was.
You proved you could do it. You proved you could go to New York, and you could do it. And then I was like, okay, now what?
Now what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So you went to Chicago, and did you find a new yoga community there, or?
Well, I wasn't there for very long. So I went to Chicago, and just a few weeks after I got back, I ended up meeting the man who would become my husband. And he still had some school to finish up. And so we were kind of long distance for a little while. And then within less than a year, probably maybe 9 months, he had gotten a job offer in San Francisco, and he said, let's go, let's do this. And I said, let's do it. It's an adventure. So we went, and we moved to San Francisco, where we lived for 5 years. So I was briefly teaching in Chicago, but not, nothing extensive. And then I really kind of took the next step when we moved to San Francisco.
I didn't know you were in San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco for 6 months. I lived in Bernal Heights for 6 months.
Yeah.
In 1994. Before we met in training. But what did you teach in San Francisco?
I did teach a bit. I was in San Francisco. It was kind of my schooling years. I went to grad school for writing. I went and did the Iyengar 200-hour training there. I'm sorry, 500-hour training, 2-year training there. So while I was there, I was in kind of a lot of in school and working at yoga studio or at other nonprofits. And then I taught a bit. I taught at the university's healthcare facility, or no, that's not the right word, fitness facility. And so I was teaching a bit there, but I honestly felt like I had a hard time fitting into a lot of yoga scenes because I felt like I was sort of the least fancy. Like I was so dedicated, and the practice totally took over in my life and really changed how I am as a person. You know, shortly after I took my first class, I felt like, oh, okay, great. And I've never really looked back since then. But I also felt like I was kind of an unfancy yogi, and I often felt intimidated by some of the things that happen in studio culture, and at least in some studios. And I also find I'm kind of a down-to-earth practitioner, that some of the stuff that gets a little bit more esoteric, it doesn't resonate with me. And I consider myself to be a deep practitioner, but I do it kind of in the way that feels most truthful and honest to me. And so
I'm going to jump in for a second because I find that really, I know that to be true of you because I've like followed your writing over the years, and I know you're a very down to earth person, but I have a memory of you giving me a polarity session. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes.
You were doing polarity work, which is not what you would think of when you think of down to earth, but you were in a very exploratory time at that time, which I was too.
Yes. I was in a very exploratory time. It is like kind of a running joke in my family that I did polarity because I know it is a beautiful form of body work and energy work. But truthfully, I don't really know even. I remember going and having that session with you and thinking, I don't even know what I'm doing. And that was when
you told me that after. We had a little conversation after, and you're like, I'm not even really sure what I'm doing with it. But yeah. But I had a great experience, I remember at the time, but, it was mostly just, we had the intention, I think.
Yeah. Right. And, I think I just think it's great to try different things, see what resonates. And, to me, it's not worth doing something that doesn't feel true and honest because I just, it doesn't feel right. I don't feel like myself. So that's kind of why it took me a long time to find my way in the yoga scene kind of after my New York days. But that was also the impetus for me to open my studio because I found like this thing was so amazing to me. And I really just felt like, well, I want to do this forever, but I couldn't visualize myself doing it anywhere. And that was when my husband was like, well, you should open a studio. And I said, that's crazy. And then I thought about it.
You didn't open a studio in San Francisco though, did you?
No, I didn't. It was at the end of my time in San Francisco that this idea came about. I was at the end of my 500-hour training. I had spent 2 years at the Iyengar Institute, really amazing teachers there and just incredible curriculum. I'm so grateful for what I learned there. It was just so foundational. I'm not an Iyengar practitioner, but it is the basis of my training, and it has influenced everything I've done. I've learned so much from that. So it was near the end of that training that, my husband had said that because I was sort of thinking, well, what's next for me? And we were already planning kind of to move back at some point. And so, yeah, we moved back in May.
Chicago, right? You moved back to Chicago, and that's where you opened your place.
And then we opened up in November of 2004. So.
Oh, well, see, 2004, it makes sense. I opened my place in 2007, so you opened yours a few years before, but that was the model at that point. Like if you were a teacher and you had the opportunity to do it, you could open up a space and start a center, because a lot of teachers they were popping up all over New York. Right.
Right. But even when you look back now, you can look back and think, wow, there weren't very many studios at all. But there already felt like that was already starting to happen. It's really interesting. And, I've had a lot of people come to me over the years asking for advice, people who are interested in opening studios. And I think what you just said is the common theme, where a lot of times a teacher is sort of saying, I love teaching, I want to do it more, therefore I will open a studio. And it's not exactly how I did it, because I've never been a full-time yoga teacher. It's never been my goal. And I find I need a more moderate amount of classes. So, I'm happiest in the 1 to 5 a week range, plus other stuff, but I don't love to teach tons and tons of group classes. It just hasn't worked for me. Mm-hmm. And so I really opened my studio wanting to provide that environment for other people to feel that they could come as they are, come in their sweatpants, come, having not done yoga before and not feel they're not part of the club. And so that was the motivation behind it. And for the first, you remember your startup days. For the first year, I taught probably 10 classes a week, and that almost broke me. And then I hired on more teachers to sort of take the load. But I always loved the community building and kind of running a professional business in a heart-oriented way. That was always my thing with the studio. That was really where it came from.
Well, I remember us paralleling after I opened my place and like the blogosphere broke out. We were both writing about being parents and having the centers. And I remember kind of like communing with you. We were kind of running in parallel at that time. That was like a very boom time for yoga. It was, I think sometimes when people come today and they say, ask advice about whatever opening a center, I think opening a center in 2004 is a very different thing than opening a center in 2018. You know what I mean? It's not at all the same landscape that you're looking at.
Oh, so true. And I think the other thing that is so true is that a lot of people want to have a studio, but don't actually want to have a business. And, you're running it. Like you've said, we've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. You're running a business and doing all the unglamorous things that you would have to do in any business that has nothing to do with yoga. That is kind of one of the challenges.
It's an important distinction, I think for most of the time that I had the center, most of the 10 years, I did not have a business. I just owned my job. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between owning your job and having a business. It was only in the end when it wasn't going well. Because for a long time, basically, I got in at the right time. So there was always enough money coming in. Mm-hmm. I didn't need to think of it as a business. As long as there was more money coming in than needed to go out, I was good.
Right. It's a pretty simple equation that way.
it worked for a long time, but at some point when things were changing and I had to kind of compete, honestly, then it did have to start to become more of a business. And I did have to think about it that way. And I did have to do some things that I hadn't done before, learn some things I hadn't learned before. So it did transition. And I guess if you have low enough overhead, you could probably get away with just owning your job. But if you're going to have a center and you're going to have, 15 or more teachers and 42 classes a week, then that's definitely a business.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. For sure.
Well, I guess then from there, we paralleled for a long time. And then, the next time I remember us coming into contact is when you started at the Yoga Alliance. You, I think, first came on as secretary, right? Right when Richard Carpel did in 2012, maybe? Is that right?
I came on. So the story of how I got involved with Yoga Alliance is that, like many people, I had been a dues paying member for a while, and that had been my only interaction, was just paying the dues. And then when Richard came on board, he put out, I don't know if you remember this, but he put out a call to the yoga community. He put out an email where he talked like nobody I'd ever heard at Yoga Alliance talk before. I hadn't really received communications from Yoga Alliance besides the sort of transactional.
We received no communications.
Yeah, you get kind of you're like, it's time to pay your dues, and there'd be a letter with that. Right. But this letter was totally different. I'm a writer. I appreciate communication. And this was really, it moved me. He basically said, hey, we acknowledge that we could be doing a better job, that we should be more transparent, that we could be more inclusive, that we could introduce more rigor, more kind of oomph to this organization. And we can't do it alone. And we are calling for volunteers. And so I immediately filled out an application along with lots and lots of other people. There was it was really amazing, for all these people who had never really seen into the organization. There were several groups of people who were formed into committees that focused around certain topics. And I was very excited to have been selected to be on the standards committee. So that's how I started. And then,
I remember that time because I went back and I found these email exchanges between you and me when you first came on and Richard, because I had this phone conversation with him after he read a blog post that I wrote, which is so ironic. But in any case, he totally won me over in the same way. He just was like, what do you think we can do to make this better? And I was like, you're awesome. I would like to give you a chance, you know? So, and I remember you and I exchanging these emails being like, isn't Richard great? You know, we were like super excited about it.
I think it takes courage for anyone or any organization to say, hey, we haven't been doing a great job. We want to do better. We know it's going to be hard, and we want to hear from people because we know we don't have all the answers. And, you know, that to me is the spirit of Yoga Alliance, because I really wasn't involved before that point. I just was peripherally aware, and I just did the RYT thing because I felt that was the right thing to do. But that set the tone for why I got involved and has been the tone ever since. And, you know, the organization, as I'm sure we'll get into, you know, has had various phases, things that have been really positive, things that could have been more positive, but it's all made up of people, in my experience, who really have great intentions and are putting so much work towards this, volunteer and not. Because all of us who were on the standards committee and the other committees that were formed at that time, all volunteers. And the board, I joined the board about a year later, a little less than a year. All the board members, we now have 10, all volunteers and yogis, and just, it's amazing. It's really amazing to me to be part of a group of people who want to say, here's what's good, here's what's not good, and let's try to do something about it.
Well, I also have this memory of you working on like a code of ethics. Is that right? Do I remember that right?
Yes.
Because you sent me something. You were working on that. Was that, do I have that memory right?
Yeah, I was the chair of the ethics committee. So when I got onto the standards committee, our first meeting was so rich, and we talked about so many topics. You know, it's like, think about this, you know, an organization that's been in existence for, I'm trying to remember what year I even got involved. So 2012. I mean, so it'd been over 10 years, maybe some 15 years. I'm not doing the math right now, but it had been around, and really very few people had seen anything. And then were invited to be part of conversations about the things that all of us have really put our life's work towards. It was so exciting. And
I know. And I think I remember a lot of good things happened. I mean, prior to that, there wasn't a website like there was now, and there wasn't like even people approving the certificates. I mean, there was like some very fundamental things that happened that I thought were certainly steps in right direction. But there was also issues back then. There was also issues back then, because I also remember going to a listening tour that Richard did, and, you know, hearing him, you know, explain some things about what the organization could do and what the organization couldn't do to people, and them sort of like seeming to me, at least, to not be able to hear what he was saying. And I felt bad for him. And I was like, oh, well, what do you do about that? Yeah. And then I also remember, quite honestly, and this is where I'm going to, I had Richard on this podcast. He was the third person who ever came on. And I was so completely green, and I did a terrible job. But I remember him saying that he took the only criticism I could get him to make, because he was such a nice guy and he wouldn't say anything bad about anybody. The only criticism that I could get out of him was that there was some difficulty about getting things done because the board didn't act on stuff, or like the board didn't do stuff. That there was some kind of sort of bureaucratical, that there was sort of like things got stilted, and we couldn't make movement forward on several things because of the way the board worked. And you were on the board at that time. So how do you remember that time when, I mean, he had to leave, and I know there was all kinds of personal reasons why that happened, but when he was leaving and you were on the board, what do you remember being the state of affairs at that time? Because I don't remember it being that great, but you seem to feel like it was always this positive trajectory.
Well, I think the trajectory is the key. You know, I think that to me, I think I tend to be an annoyingly optimistic person. But I do feel like what my experience with Yoga Alliance has been about the trajectory. Where are we starting? what steps are we taking towards this goal? And when I came in, you mentioned, one of the things you mentioned was the code of ethics. At that point, Yoga Alliance did not have the ability to revoke a credential because we had never set that up. So someone could commit an egregious, breach of misconduct, of sexual misconduct or otherwise, and then would just stay in our system. And that was kind of what was happening when we started. There were some scandals that had emerged, and that was beginning to kind of bubble up. And that was one major thing that the organization didn't have authority to do, which was very important, because if we're about public safety and about, the standards, the quality of yoga teaching and training, you have to be able to hold people to a standard of behavior and of what's acceptable and what's not, so that they don't bear that credential and then have, horrible behavior behind it. So
Richard did set that up, though, right? He set up a way where now someone could call the Yoga Alliance and someone could have their registration revoked, right?
So, and it's not that quite, it's so simple as that. It was a whole team of people. Richard was the person who was in charge as we began the work of the ethics committee. And then there were a lot of people involved. So, we got volunteers to be on that committee. We had staff support, and we just talked through all the issues because we wanted to, be responsible and to follow protocols set up in other industries. So we looked at how other industries handle that stuff. And it isn't as simple as, it's a complicated thing, but it's an important thing. And to me, that goes to the trajectory question. Yes, you're correct. Not everything was great at all moments in Yoga Alliance's history. But from where I stand, when I came in, there were things that were lacking. And basically leadership, whether it was Richard or any of the leaders since then, have said, okay, here are the things that are lacking. What is the next one we're going to tackle? And it's been a sort of step-by-step. Some of them have been missteps, in terms of not the action, but maybe the way we communicated them. But I do feel that, even at that time, that there was a lot of good happening, and it was step-by-step.
Well, I know then after Richard left, there was a big period of time there, like some years maybe even, where not a lot happened. Like nobody took that job. So what was going on during that period of time? I mean, I guess there was improvements. And I guess part of the issue is, and let's just be honest about it, like it's very rare that a not-for-profit organization is as well-funded as the Yoga Alliance. So when it's well-funded, there's not a lot of incentive always to change anything because everything operates fine on some level. So,
you could look at it from that perspective, but I would never say that was our focus on a board level.
No, I'm not sure that your focus on that or anybody working there was thinking that. That's just a reality of the situation. So I'm like, why wasn't there a new CEO hired after Richard to continue the process of reform that he started?
I would say that when Richard left, I think that the shifts that had been made in the time that he was there got us to a place where we kind of were needing a different type of a structure. And I think that it wasn't that position wasn't filled. We had a kind of a different title in that role, but we did have a leader of the organization. And, she continued the progress that we had made working with the board. And it was another time of steps towards a goal. And that time may to you seem like nothing was happening, but there were a lot of things happening in terms of what we were bringing forth with educational content. The advocacy work started to really begin in earnest then, which was hugely important. And you point to the fact that we're well-funded. Thank goodness, because some of these advocacy fights, I know New York beat it.
I know. That was something that Richard got going because he was all about that. We talked about that when he came on the podcast. He was an advocacy guy. And so that advocacy work was certainly what was happening during those years. That's true. But I want to also say, like you said, that the reason you came to Yoga Alliance was because Richard put out this call to the membership. There wasn't any of that kind of outreach because I was a member and there wasn't, I'm saying there might have been things happening, but it wasn't happening like in that way.
Sure. I think that's fair. And I also think it's okay for leaders to have different styles. And I think the leader we had in place at that time, that was not her style. And we were in a place where I think that was okay with what the organization was doing. I mean, I think that there are different leaders for different times. And honestly, as we got to the point of bringing David in, that was a time where we knew we needed that voice. And, we knew we needed a leader who that was their passion, their skill, their talent, their experience. And that was why it was such a wonderful thing to have David come on board at that point, because first, we needed that outreach, that connection, the communication, but also I think we felt it was sort of a pivot time for us, where we knew that it was time to, find the new direction. So, it's like, it's not, it's so interesting to be part of it in the moment. And then looking back on it, you have such different perspective on how it went, or from the outside too, someone who maybe doesn't have as much exposure to it, or, maybe hasn't just been paying as much attention. It can be just, you can get a different point of view on it. But
sure. Well, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question about being on the board so I can understand more. Like, how involved is the board in kind of daily operations? Like, after you hire David and he has a team of people, he does the job and then he reports back to you guys. How involved is the board in the actual daily decisions or stuff that gets made at Yoga Lions?
That has been an evolution too. I think at the time when Barbara was, our leader, we were much more involved in day to day and much more in the weeds. And that was kind of what was needed at that time. But as a board, we realized as we were, preparing to welcome David on, that is not where we can best serve, because we're all volunteers, limited time, have our own careers, families. And so we made a conscious shift. And, David, I don't think would have had it any other way, because that's the kind of guy he is. He's big vision. But the board really shifted then when he came on board, and we would definitely stay out of the details, because it wasn't needed and it wasn't productive. So at a board level, when we have a conversation, we're going to talk about high level things. And part of what happened when David came on was there wasn't a huge infrastructure of kind of senior leaders in the organization. And that took time to build. So the hiring, bringing on those people, was what happened over the year plus, first year plus of David being here. And that enabled us to, as a board, to sort of entrust these incredibly capable people to do the work. And we get to have the really exciting and difficult sometimes conversations. But yeah, we are not involved in the day-to-day, which is very positive.
And what was the process of becoming a board member? Like, you answered the call because you wanted to get involved at Yoga Lions. Mm-hmm. Who's the person who decided, yes, let's have Kerry be on the board? Was it the other board members? My memory of exactly how that went, I don't remember who in the board was. I think a board member and also Richard asked me to join the board at that time, because I had been on the standards committee, and a few people who had been involved at that time came on the board. And it was a great, because it's difficult. It's difficult to make sure you're getting the right fit, to find out, who is interested, who wants to be part of that process. And so, yeah, the board is, it depends. Everyone has been sort of a different process but that was kind of the way I came in. I see. I guess that's sort of the first sort of thing I want to put out there, is that I think that sometimes some of the issues, I put out this blog post and I got everybody mad. But one of the things that is interesting to me that I'm curious about is where we're at right now, is that the process of the board coming about is a sort of political process, maybe, where none of the board members are elected. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like, as an organization, we could elect board members.
I totally agree. I think that's a possibility. I think that right now, again, talking about evolution and baby steps, I think that the organization really had a lot of internal work to do and to get to, kind of basically fulfilling the promise to its members. I mean, we exist to serve the members, like to serve the teachers in the schools who are entrusting us to do the good work in the community, not only just to give them the RYT or the RYS, but to bring value. And, we can talk more about that as well. But I think that, there was just a far distance between what the organization was doing, at least when I stepped in, prior to that point. It had kind of just been a list of names of who had this designation. And what happened in the years since then is all these robust offerings, education, the benefits, the perks, the advocacy work. There's so much happening, and now the service orientation. And so it took a lot of time to get to that point. And I think at this point in time, right now we don't have an elected board. And I think that is something to consider for the future, because I think that it would be a really exciting way to consider expanding our reach and bringing in more diverse voices and opinions. I think that at this point in time, up until this point, it would have been too destabilizing to do that, because we just weren't in a place where there was a solid, we weren't on such solid ground as we are on now.
Mm. And when you were in the board and these high-level conversations are happening about even to hire David, what were those decisions based on? Just the viewpoints and opinions of the people on the board, or was there other ways that you guys were basing the decisions that you were making on?
Well, I think that, the hiring process was largely first a look inside. So it was, as a board, we knew we were at that place where we needed new leaders.
I'm sorry to jump in again, but what was it that made you feel like you needed to do something if everything was going great in the interim and things had been progressing from Richard, even if I couldn't see it? What happened that made you guys then feel, oh, we really need to do something different now?
Well, there wasn't a breaking point, I think what you kind of touched on earlier was what we also were feeling, was that we needed an outward facing orientation in our leadership. And, Barbara did a great job in her time at Yoga Alliance. She was very upfront and in her time in leadership, she was very upfront with us after Richard left and she took the number one spot, that was not her strength or her interest, was doing that public facing kind of community outreach piece. And so we knew that, and we felt that was, for the time being, that was an okay thing. And then when we got to a place where we felt we needed to take next steps and sort of see vision, we needed that person. And so I think that finding out what we needed first was the first step towards getting David on board.
That makes sense. I guess I'm just wondering, how does that actually happen? One person in the room goes, hey, you guys, I think we need to do something. And everybody else goes, yeah, I think so too. Is that what we're talking about? Well,
not exactly like that. I think it was more of an, over time, a feeling of a need that happens. And, it's never really one person. Maybe there's sort of an idea that comes forward, but I wouldn't say it's one person saying, let's do this, and then we all do it. But I think that the opportunity to bring David on, the timing was really fortunate. He had left his role at Kripalu, and we, had kind of had some interactions with him, and it just was really fortunate timing.
And how long before, or was it before, I guess it was before David come on, did Brandon Hartzell lift? Because I remember you were secretary. When did Brandon leave and you become the chair?
I became chair in 2017. And then Brandon, as the way we structure things is that the chair will stay on for another year just for continuity's sake, which was so helpful. Brandon, I don't know if you know, Brandon's a really tall guy. I always like to joke I had big shoes to fill, but he had really done so much for the organization. I'm, so grateful for the work he had done. So he only overlapped for a brief period with David, not even a year.
Mm-hmm. All right. So then I remember David got brought on and I talked with him, and, he was a very sharp guy and he had a plan to go out and do this review of things and do the listening tour and the survey. And he hired, like, you're right, he created sort of, I don't know if you call them departments or committees. He set up a whole bunch of structure, right, in the background, I guess, or not the background, at the organization. And then I'm curious, in all of this process of gathering this stuff and bringing this information in, was the board seeing that information? Was he making reports to you along the way? Again, I'm kind of curious. I know you said that you're not there on the day-to-day, but like, what were you getting reports about what's going on in that process? Or like what was your involvement as the last year has been happening, where David's been out there kind of executing the plan?
I'm sure, because you've spoken with David, you could guess. He's a very communicative person. He's very skilled with how he facilitates conversations and how he kind of facilitates the process of working towards new ideas and initiatives. And so it was very much in partnership. And David's always the first one to cite all the people who were behind something, that he would never present an idea and say, this is me, I did this. It was always, Shannon did this, or, he's going to cite the board's involvement, or he's always going to it was always very collaborative, which I really appreciated and think it's a great model just for leadership in general. But the board gets regular reports from all the different departments so that we can kind of keep high-level tabs on what's happening and where progress is being made. And then we have a series of kind of conversations and calls. The full board meets a few times a year in person and over the phone. And then a smaller group of the officers will meet every month with the executive to talk about, well, what are our questions from these reports? And that's the way things happen on a board level. It's really great because we get a tiny glimpse into what's happening without having to see how it's all executed, because that wouldn't be very helpful for us to get involved in that. But it was very much a collaborative process, and one that we were kept very much in the loop on. And I know, and that our input was really desired, our strategic input. And that was, again, like I said before, that's what the board wanted, but that was really what David wanted. He wants strategic partners because he knows, like we all do, not one person can say what's best for yoga. And, that's sort of how Yoga Alliance was founded. We're not going to dictate what style, what approach. It's all of these different approaches to yoga are important, valid, and have their place. And similarly, all of the ideas have merit and need to be aired. And that's really the spirit in which we've done everything up to this point, and that we continue to, even now with what we're working with the standards review.
Well, I certainly found David to be a skilled communicator, and I certainly appreciate also the humility of giving credit where credit is due. But he did do stuff. Like, the whole reason you guys hired him, none of that would have happened. You said he came on and he did stuff. So as self-effacing as he may have been, he certainly was the guy who made the stuff happen. So I can appreciate that he put smart people in place. But there is the thing, when Richard was there, stuff happened. When David was there, stuff happened. And I'm not saying it should be a guy or whatever, but I'm just saying.
I was going to say, also when Barbara was there, stuff happened. I think it's important. And, a lot of our executive team or our senior leadership team, it is largely women in this organization.
That's true.
I think it's really one of the stories that is not told about Yoga Alliance is how in a community and in a field that is predominantly female practitioners, but very disproportionately has men in kind of powerful positions or in authority positions. Yoga Alliance has really done an incredible job of finding incredible and capable and amazing women who, yes, David did a ton of stuff. And he also did it in partnership with his executive and leadership team, many of whom are women. So I think it is important to put that in there.
I agree. He did hire very interesting and diverse people. So my question is, how involved was the board in hiring the senior leadership team?
The board was not very involved in that, and I think appropriately so, because that is not our job. We're not in operations. I mean,
So
first of all,
those were just David's calls because the membership didn't get to vote on the senior leadership team either.
but do you know an organization where they vote on the hires?
I don't know of an organization necessarily, but I think it's possible that that the people who are going to lead the organization would be hired by the membership because they're the ones who are supposed to lead us in representing us. And I'm just saying, in theory, like we're kind of getting to where some of my issues are with even what the process has been over the last year, because I feel like my problem is that I felt that along the way in this process, David was steering the ship as much as there's all kinds of great people he hired. And in the process, there was all kinds of great conversations happening, all kinds of Zoom meetings. I know people who were involved in the Zoom meetings. There's all kinds of great work that being done, hundreds of experts. I understand how big the thing that he set up was and how many really smart and amazing people have been involved in contributing their work and their research, and all of that's been happening, but that process has been happening in a black box. I know there's this, we're being transparent and we're telling you everything we're doing along the way, but not really, because everything's coming through a filter before it gets to us. The membership hasn't voted on any of these things. We don't know. You're privy to stuff. Maybe you're getting reports, but who decided that these folks are going to be our leaders and where they're leading us has not been voted on by the membership. It hasn't been something we've been a part of.
So a lot of things there to talk about. One, you mentioned this black box idea. I am unclear about what you mean by that because, in order to run an organization of this size that serves as many members as it does, of course, there's no way for all of the members to be able to have a say in anything. And, as I just shared with you, even the board does not have a say in a lot of these things because it's not really our job. We hire capable leaders because they're not just yogis. Most of our staff are yogis, but they also have extensive business experience. Some of them have come from government work. Some of them come from legal work. They are skilled in that piece, in running the business. Just like we talked about with yoga studios, how a lot of times yoga studios don't succeed because a teacher just wanted to teach classes in their own space and didn't want to run the business. It's sort of a similar thing. You get the person in the job to do the thing they are trained and experienced at doing. So I don't see what,
I'm going to take issue only because earlier in this conversation, you said that the purpose, the principle of the Yoga Alliance is to serve the membership. And then what you're saying is there's going to be a group of people, a board of directors who have come about not through elections by some unclear means of political, will you be on the board or whatever it is. And then we're going to make some decisions that are definitely going to shape how this organization is representing you and to trust us, that we're going to get really smart people to do it. And I'm saying that there's no reason, like I remember when Richard did the logo and he did the whole thing and he put out a call and he put up different designs and we got to vote. And you know what? You didn't pick the one that I liked. They picked the one that I didn't want. But you know what? I was okay with it because I was actually part of that process. And I don't feel like the process, the outreach that got you involved in the organization, and I don't think that the kind of outreach that happened when we did the logo is what happened in this process. And maybe that was because that's David's style. You said people have different leadership styles. But the leadership style of David was to talk about transparency, but it wasn't transparent. And I'll give you one very solid example. We did the big survey. I had Andrew come on and I got all heated with him and I challenged him and, he was saying the survey. And then when the survey comes out, If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.